They say the dust in that country holds memories, that the wind whispers names of men long gone. They say some men are born from that dust, hard and silent, carrying the weight of a sun-scorched sky in their shoulders. And they say one such man was a ghost, a whisper himself, a man they called Cain after he walked out of the smoke and fire of Cinder Creek, leaving 70 government marshals to the dust from which they came. But ghosts, like all weary things, eventually seek a place to rest. And the wind, it is said, blew his fading trail toward a small, stubborn patch of land held by a woman as unyielding as the rock beneath her feet. Her name was Ilara, and she did not believe in ghosts. She believed in the burn of the sun on her neck, the ache in her back, and the fierce, consuming love she held for her son, Leo. Her world was a small square of parched earth, a leaning farmhouse, and a well that threatened to run dry with every passing week. It was a world under siege, not by spirits, but by a man of flesh and greed named Bartholomew Thorne, who wanted her water and her land, and who saw her as little more than another weed to be cleared. The day the ghost arrived, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The air was thick and still, holding its breath before the inevitable violence of a summer storm. Ilara was mending a fence post, her knuckles raw, her faded dress clinging to her with sweat. Leo, small and quiet for his 7 years, sat in the shade of the porch, carving a piece of scrap wood with his father's old knife. He was a watchful boy, his eyes holding the same deep, serious brown as his mother's. He saw the man first. A stumble in the distance, a dark shape detaching itself from the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. Not riding, but walking. Or rather, staggering. He didn't call out. He just watched, his little hands freezing around the wood. Ilara followed her son's gaze, her own hand going still. She straightened slowly, every muscle tense. Strangers were rarely a blessing. The figure grew clearer, a man moving with the lurching gait of the gravely wounded. He was tall, dressed in clothes the color of the road, and he clutched his side, a dark stain spreading through the fabric like a fatal bloom. He made it another 20 yards before his legs gave out, collapsing into the sagebrush with a finality that stirred the dust around him. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to grab Leo, bolt the door, and pray he was already dead. Thorne's men had been circling for weeks, their threats growing bolder. This could be a trick. But then the wind shifted, carrying a low groan, a sound of pure animal pain. It was a sound that bypassed caution and struck at something deeper, something fiercely human. She looked at Leo, whose wide eyes were fixed on the fallen man. In them, she saw not fear, but a solemn curiosity, a child's unfiltered empathy. She wiped her dusty hands on her apron, a gesture of weary resolution. She would not teach her son to leave a man to die in the dirt, no matter the risk. She picked up the heavy iron skillet she kept by the door for protection and walked out, her steps measured and deliberate. The man was unconscious, his face turned to the side, half buried in the dust. He was younger than she'd expected, his face etched with lines of hardship that made him seem ancient. A rough, dark stubble covered a jaw set like stone even in unconsciousness. A long, faded scar cut a pale line across one temple. But it was the stillness of him that was most unsettling. It was not the peace of sleep, but the profound quiet of a man who had made a home in silence. His right hand was curled loosely, just inches from the butt of a strange, heavy-looking pistol holstered on his hip. It was worn, the metal bearing the scars of long use, the grip smooth from a constant, familiar touch. She saw the wound then, a ragged tear in his side, clumsily bandaged with a strip of his own shirt, now soaked through. It was bad. Likely fatal without care. Hesitantly, she knelt, her eyes scanning the unforgiving landscape around them. No one. Just the vast, empty stage of the plains and the promise of a coming storm. She made her decision. With a strength born of years of hauling water and wrestling with the unforgiving land, she managed to get her shoulder under his arm and began the slow, agonizing process of dragging him toward the house. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. His head lolled against her, his breath coming in shallow, rasping hitches. Inside, she laid him on the worn rug before the hearth, the only place she could easily clean. Leo stood in the doorway, silent, his wooden bird forgotten on the porch. His gaze was fixed on the man, on the dark pistol, on the stark reality of violence brought into their home. Ilara fetched water, cloths, and the small tin of medical supplies her husband had left behind. As she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric, her fingers brushed against something hard tucked inside his shirt pocket. She pulled it out. It was a small, intricately carved bird, a hawk, worn smooth with time. Its wooden eye seemed to stare into nothing. For a moment, she held the two objects in her mind, the brutal, efficient pistol, and the delicate, patient carving. They did not belong to the same man. And yet, here they were. The storm broke then, the first fat drops of rain splattering against the window pane like thrown pebbles. The sky cracked open, and the world outside dissolved into a roaring curtain of grey. Inside, there was only the sound of the rain, Ilara's steady breathing, and the faint, ragged whisper of life from the stranger sleeping on her floor. She didn't know she had just brought the grey ghost of Cinder Creek into her home. She only knew he was a man, bleeding on her floor, and that outside, a storm was raging. For 3 days, the man drifted in a fevered haze. Ilara cleaned and stitched the wound, a deep gash that spoke of a knife fight, not an accident. She forced broth and water between his cracked lips, working with a detached efficiency that masked the turmoil inside her. Every creak of the floorboard sent a jolt of fear through her. She slept in a chair by the door, the iron skillet in her lap, her senses tuned to the stranger's breathing. Leo was her shadow, quiet and watchful. He'd retrieved the wooden hawk the man had dropped, turning it over and over in his small hands, studying its form. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Ilara entered the room to find him awake, his eyes open and clear. They were the color of slate, flat and unreadable, and they followed her every move. He did not speak. He simply watched, a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any threat. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his jaw tight against the searing pain in his side. His gaze flicked to the holstered pistol she had placed on the mantelpiece, then back to her. The water was foul, she said, her voice steady, though her heart was not. From the wound. I gave you what I had. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes dropped to Leo, who stood half-hidden behind his mother's skirt, clutching his own half-finished carving. The man's expression did not change, but something in the hard set of his eyes seemed to soften for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible shift, like stone warming in the sun. He looked back at Ilara. Silas, he said. The name was rough, torn from his throat by disuse. It sounded like gravel settling. Just the name. Nothing more. No explanation, no thanks. Ilara nodded back. Ilara. This is Leo, and so began their strange cohabitation. Silas recovered with an unnerving speed. Within a week, he was on his feet, moving with a stiff but determined grace. He was a phantom in her house, a silent presence that took up more space than his physical form. He never initiated conversation. His words were rare and spare, offered up like precious coins only when absolutely necessary. But his actions spoke a different language. The morning she woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe, she found him by the woodpile, his shirt off despite the chill, his back a road map of old, faded scars. He had chopped enough wood to last them a month, each piece split clean and stacked with geometric precision. He fixed the broken fence post she had struggled with, sinking it deep and securing it with a skill that was both swift and certain. He noticed the slight wobble in the porch step and repaired it without being asked. He would sit on that step for hours as evening fell, his slate eyes on the horizon, the carved hawk turning over and over in his long fingers. He was watching. Waiting. For what, Ilara did not know. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, his gaze often drifting to Leo. He never approached the boy directly, but he would leave his own finished carvings, a wolf, a running deer, on the porch rail where Leo would find them. The boy, in turn, began to lose his fear. He would sit on the other end of the porch, working on his own carving, the two of them existing in a shared, comfortable silence, a master and his unwitting apprentice. Trust was not a word Ilara would have used. It was something less defined, a fragile truce built in the quiet spaces between chores and sunsets. She still saw the ghost of violence in him, in the way his hand would instinctively drift toward his hip when a horseman appeared in the distance, in the chilling economy of his movements. But she also saw a profound weariness, a man who had walked through hell and was desperately searching for a place to cool his feet. One afternoon, the dust on the horizon resolved into 3 riders. It was Thorne's men. Her stomach tightened into a familiar knot. Silas was mending a harness near the barn, and he went still, his head lifting like a wolf scenting danger. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness, a sudden, sharp focus that charged the air. The lead rider was a man named Decker, a brutish oaf with a cruel mouth and small, piggish eyes. He swung down from his horse, letting the reins drop. "Well now, Ilara," he sneered, his gaze sweeping over the tidy woodpile and the mended fence. "Looks like you got yourself some help." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Mr. Thorne is getting impatient. He sent us to remind you of his generous offer." "It's not an offer, it's a threat," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly but her chin held high. "This land is mine." Decker laughed, a short, ugly sound. His eyes fell on Silas, who had not moved from the barn entrance. He stood in the shadows, his face unreadable, his hands empty but resting near his thighs. "Who's this?" Decker asked, hooking a thumb toward Silas. "Your new man." Silas's eyes met Decker's. They were flat, empty of emotion, giving the other man nothing to hold on to. The emptiness seemed to unnerve Decker more than any open aggression would have. "He's just a drifter," Ilara said quickly. "Helps with chores for his keep." Decker swaggered toward the barn, his men flanking him. He looked Silas up and down, a contemptuous smirk on his face. He saw a quiet, worn-out man in dusty clothes, his gaze distant. He saw a nobody. "You work cheap, old man," Decker taunted. Silas didn't answer. He just watched, his stillness a physical presence. Decker, needing to assert his dominance, shoved Silas hard in the shoulder. "I'm talking to you." As Silas stumbled back a step, his boots scuffing the dirt. He caught his balance, his body coiled tight as a spring. For a single, terrifying second, Ilara saw something flash in his eyes, a flicker of cold, lethal fire. It was there and then gone, replaced by the same unnerving calm. His hand, which had started to lift, dropped back to his side. He just absorbed the blow, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He was choosing this. Choosing peace over instinct. The sight of his restraint was more frightening than if he had fought back. It was the restraint of a man who knew, with absolute certainty, the damage he could do. Decker, taking the lack of reaction as weakness, laughed again and turned away. "Mr. Thorne gives you till the new moon," he said over his shoulder to Ilara. "Then the offer expires. And so does our patience." They mounted up and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and derision in their wake. Ilara's breath came out in a shaky sigh. She looked at Silas. He was staring after the riders, his expression unchanged, but she saw the faint tremor in his hand as he raised it to wipe a smear of dust from his cheek. He had bled for her once. Now, he had bled his pride. A debt was being settled between them, unspoken and profound. That evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, she found him on the porch, staring out at the land he had just defended with his silence. She walked out and handed him a cup of coffee. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time they had touched since she had tended his wound. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked at her, his slate eyes searching her face. He didn't ask what for. He knew. He simply gave another of his small, solemn nods. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of shared hardship, of threats faced together, of a quiet man's terrible, hidden strength. And in that silence, something fragile and tenacious, like a desert flower after a rain, began to take root. The new moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, a silent promise of endings and beginnings. Thorne's deadline. The days leading up to it had been thick with a tense, brittle quiet. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Thorne's men had not returned, but their presence was a shadow on the edge of the property, a sickness in the air. They had poisoned the creek upstream, and Ilara had spent 2 days hauling water from the deep well, her back screaming in protest. Silas had worked alongside her, silent and relentless, his movements economical, conserving a strength she was beginning to understand was vast and terrifying. He said nothing of the poisoned water, but she saw the muscle that jumped in his jaw as he stared at the sluggish, tainted stream. It was a personal offense, an attack on the fragile life they were tending. The bullying had grown more pointed, more personal. Decker and his men seemed to take Silas's quietness as a personal challenge. They would ride by, not to threaten Ilara, but to needle him. One afternoon, they found him reshoeing her old mare. Decker dismounted and kicked over the bucket of tools. "Clumsy, ain't you, farmhand?" he'd sneered. Silas had paused, his hand still on the horse's hoof. He had looked at the scattered tools, then up at Decker. The look was utterly devoid of heat, as cold and distant as a star. He said nothing. He simply knelt, gathered the tools, and went back to his work. The sheer force of his control was a physical thing. Ilara, watching from the kitchen window, felt a rage so pure it stole her breath. It was not for herself, it was for him. For the dignity he refused to surrender. "Leave him be," she had snapped, marching out onto the porch, the skillet heavy in her hand. Decker had just laughed. "Your woman fights your battles for you?" Pitiful, but they had left. His passivity, coupled with her fire, seemed to confound them. They couldn't find a foothold. That evening, the air was different. Silas was on the porch, not carving, not watching the horizon. He was cleaning his pistol. He did it with the focused reverence of a priest tending an altar. The weapon was disassembled on a clean cloth, each piece wiped and oiled with meticulous care. The lamplight caught the scarred metal, the worn grip. It was not a tool of his trade, it was a part of him. Leo, emboldened by weeks of shared silence, approached him. He held out his own carving, the one he had been working on since the day Silas arrived. It was a hawk, a clumsy, earnest imitation of the one Silas carried. Its wings were uneven, the head too large, but it was made with a child's pure intent. "For you," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. Silas stopped his work. He looked at the small wooden bird in the boy's outstretched hand. Very slowly, he reached out and took it. He held it in his palm, his long, calloused fingers dwarfing it. He studied it with the same intensity he gave everything. His thumb gently stroked the uneven wings. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, the first unguarded sound she had ever heard him make. His eyes, when he lifted them to Leo, were no longer slate. They were clouded with something ancient and painful, a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the porch. He looked from the boy to Ilara, who stood frozen in the doorway, a witness to a moment of sacred intimacy. In his gaze, she saw the ghost of a promise, a debt he could never repay to someone long dead. This boy, this woman, this patch of dirt, they were becoming his chance at a different kind of payment. Atonement. He tucked the boy's clumsy hawk into his shirt pocket, next to his own. He then looked at Ilara, and for the first time, he truly spoke to her, not just with a name or a necessary word, but from the desolate country of his past. "There was a town," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Cinder Creek. I was a ranger. Not a marshal. A scout." He paused, the words costing him. "There was a deal. Mining rights. Stolen from the people who lived there. A senator, a man like Thorne, but with a government seal to his eyes were fixed on the disassembled pistol. I had the proof. Account books. Ledgers." He began to reassemble the gun, his hands moving with fluid, unconscious grace. Click. Slide. They sent 70 marshals to get those ledgers back. Not to arrest me. To bury me and the truth with me. Click. The cylinder spun, a soft, menacing whisper. They cornered me in the old land office. Set it on fire to smoke me out. He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. They called it a massacre. Said an outlaw named Cain killed 70 good men. But it wasn't a massacre. It was an extermination. And I was the one who was supposed to be extinct. He held the reassembled pistol in his hand, its weight familiar, terrible. The only thing that came out of that fire with me, he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a growl, was the ghost. Ilara finally understood. The stillness, the silence, the haunted eyes. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from the man they had tried to make him. The man he had been forced to become for one single, hellish night. The quiet farmhand was a fiction. The ghost was his reality. And Bartholomew Thorne, with his petty greed and his sneering thugs, was about to try and bully a ghost. The new moon offered no light, a fitting shroud for what was to come. The night was as black as the inside of a coffin. The wind had died completely, leaving the air unnaturally still, amplifying every small sound, the chirp of a cricket, the rustle of a dry leaf. It was the silence before a final, violent crack. Inside the small farmhouse, the lamp was out. Ilara and Leo were in the root cellar, the heavy wooden door bolted from the outside. Silas had put them there himself. He hadn't asked. He had looked at Ilara, his slate eyes filled with a grim, resolute purpose, and simply said, "Stay. Until I come for you." There was no arguing with the man who stood before her. The quiet farmhand was gone, stripped away like a disguise. In his place stood the grey ghost of Cinder Creek, a figure of lethal calm. He moved through the darkened house with a liquid grace, a shadow among shadows. He checked the bolt on the cellar door, his hand lingering for a second. In that brief touch, Ilara, listening from the darkness below, felt the weight of his promise. To protect. To finish this. Outside, the muffled sound of hoofbeats grew, a dull, drumming rhythm that vibrated through the earth. Not 3 riders this time. A dozen. Thorne had brought his entire pack of hyenas. Silas stood by the window, a mere silhouette against the starless night. He watched them dismount, their shapes dark and menacing. Thorne was with them, a portly figure on a fine horse, staying safely in the background. Decker strode forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Ilara," he bellowed, his voice ugly in the profound quiet. "Time's up. Come on out, or we burn you out." The threat hung in the air, a vile echo of Silas's own past. A muscle in Silas's jaw bunched. He drew the heavy pistol from its holster. The sound of the hammer being cocked was a single, sharp punctuation mark in the silence. It was impossibly loud. Decker and his men froze. "Who's that?" one of them whispered nervously. Silas stepped out of the front door and onto the porch. He didn't stride out. He simply appeared, as if the darkness itself had given him form. He stood there, the pistol held loosely at his side, its long barrel pointing toward the dirt. "She's not coming out," Silas said. His voice was different now. Not rough from disuse, but cold and clear, honed to a razor's edge. It carried across the yard with an unnatural clarity. Decker squinted, then let out a bark of laughter, though it sounded strained. "Well, look what we have here. The farmhand wants to be a hero." He took a step forward. "Put the gun down, old man, before you hurt yourself." Silas didn't move. He didn't raise the gun. He just watched them, his gaze sweeping over the group, counting, assessing. 2 men began to circle around toward the barn, trying to flank him. His eyes didn't seem to follow them, but he knew. "Thorne," Silas called out, his voice cutting through Decker's bluster, ignoring him completely. "You came all this way." Hiding behind your hired help, Thorne shifted uncomfortably on his horse. "This doesn't concern you, Drifter. You made it my concern when you poisoned the water," Silas stated, a simple fact delivered with the weight of a death sentence. Decker had had enough. Light the barn, he roared to the 2 men who were creeping around the side. "We'll smoke them out." It was the wrong word. The wrong threat. As the men turned with their torches, Silas moved. It wasn't fast. It was efficient. The world seemed to slow down. His pistol rose, not in a hurry, but with a terrible, smooth inevitability. A flash of orange split the darkness. The crack of the shot was deafening. The man with the torch screamed and crumpled, his leg giving out from under him. The torch fell, sputtering in the dirt. Before the second man could react, another flash, another crack. The second torch fell. Silas hadn't aimed to kill. He had aimed at their legs. Crippling, not killing. Panic erupted. These were bullies, not soldiers. They were paid to intimidate a lone woman, not face a gunman of impossible skill. "He's just one man," Decker bellowed, drawing his own pistol, fumbling with it in his haste. Silas melted back into the deeper shadows of the porch. A shot rang out from Decker's gun, splintering the wood where Silas had been standing a second before. Two more of Thorne's men opened fire, their shots wild, peppering the front of the house. The response was not a hail of bullets. It was a single, carefully placed shot from the darkness of the barn. One of the shooters yelped and dropped his gun, clutching a shattered shoulder. Silas was no longer on the porch. He was moving, using the very darkness they had counted on as his ally. He was a ghost. Another shot, this one from behind the water trough. A man cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground. For shots. For men down, wounded, moaning, their will to fight utterly broken. The remaining gunmen looked around wildly, firing at shadows, at the corners of the house, at the night itself. They were fighting the landscape, and the landscape was fighting back. Decker stood in the middle of the yard, turning in circles, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Where is he?" he screamed. "Right here," a voice said, low and calm, from directly behind him. Decker froze solid. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with horror. Silas stood 3 feet away, his pistol aimed steady at Decker's chest. He hadn't made a sound. "You," Decker whispered, his bravado gone, leaving only a pathetic whimper. "Who are you?" Silas's eyes were like chips of ice. "I'm the man you pushed," he said softly. He didn't shoot. He moved with blinding speed, the barrel of his gun lashing out, catching Decker across the temple. The big man went down like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. The fight was over. It had lasted less than a minute. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and fled into the night. Now, there was only Thorne, sitting on his horse, his face pale as death in the faint starlight. Silas walked toward him, the pistol never wavering. He stopped at the horse's head. "They told me you were dead," Thorne stammered, his voice shaking. "They said you burned at Cinder Creek." "Kane, the report was wrong," Silas said, the words echoing their earlier conversation, now imbued with a terrifying finality. He reached up and grabbed the reins of Thorne's expensive horse. With a cold, deliberate calm, he looked up at the land baron, the man whose greed had brought this violence to the one place of peace he had found. "Get off the horse," Silas commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "This land is not for sale." He didn't kill him. Death was too simple a punishment. He would let him live with the humiliation, with the knowledge of the ghost he had awakened. Thorne, stripped of his power and his men, scrambled from the saddle and backed away, stumbling into the darkness, a broken, defeated man. The dust settled. The moans of the wounded were the only sound. Silas stood alone in the yard, the smoke from his pistol curling up into the still night air, a prayer to a god he no longer believed in. He was the ghost, the killer, the protector. And he was, finally, home. The first hint of dawn was a fragile line of grey on the eastern horizon, diluting the absolute black of the night. The air was cool and carried the metallic tang of spent gunpowder. Silas stood in the yard, a solitary figure amidst the quiet wreckage of the battle. The wounded men were gone. He had patched them up just enough to ride, taken their guns, and sent them away with a single, cold instruction: never return. They had scrambled to obey, their fear of him a palpable force. Thorne's horse was tied to the fence, a silent spoil of war. The yard was littered with dropped weapons and dark stains in the dust. It was a scene of violence, but the violence was over. The deep, guttural tension that had held the farm in its grip for weeks had finally snapped, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. From the cellar, Ilara had heard it all. The terrifying crack of Silas's pistol, so different from the wild, panicked shots of Thorne's men. The shouts, the screams, the sudden, final quiet. She had held Leo close, her body a shield, her heart a wild drum against his small back. When the silence stretched on, she waited. She trusted him. She waited for his hand on the bolt. The sound of the outside bolt sliding back was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. She pushed the door open and climbed the steps, Leo clinging to her skirt. The sight that met her was stark. Silas stood with his back to them, looking out at the coming dawn. His shoulders were slumped, not in defeat, but in a terrible, soul-deep weariness. The fight had cost him something, not blood, but a piece of the peace he had so carefully tried to build. She saw the dark stains on the ground, the discarded pistols. She saw the evidence of what he could do, of the man he was. She felt no fear. All the fear she had ever harbored for him had been burned away in the crucible of the night, reforged into something else. Awe. Gratitude. A deep, aching understanding. He turned then, as if sensing her presence. His face was a mask of exhaustion. His slate eyes were not cold now, they were raw, exposed. He looked at her, then at Leo, and a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed his features. He had brought the violence of his past to their doorstep. He started, his voice rough, but the words failed him. He didn't know what to say. He was a man of actions, not apologies. Ilara walked toward him, her steps sure and steady. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She reached out, not with hesitation, but with purpose, and her hand came to rest on his arm. His muscles tensed under her touch, surprised. "You have a new cut," she said softly, her voice perfectly calm. She was looking at a fresh gash on his forearm, a shallow wound he must have gotten in the chaos. It was bleeding sluggishly. Her focus on this small, mundane injury was an act of profound acceptance. She was not seeing the ghost, the legendary killer. She was seeing Silas, a man who was hurt and needed tending. Her quiet, practical care was a balm on the raw wound of his soul. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. The carefully constructed walls around him, the ones that had survived Cinder Creek, that had weathered years of solitude, began to crumble under the weight of one woman's gentle touch. He let out a slow breath, and with it, years of tension seemed to flow out of him. Leo, seeing his mother's calm, stepped forward from behind her. He walked up to Silas and looked at the blood on his arm. Then he looked up at the tall, silent man's face. He reached into his own small pocket and pulled out the crude wooden hawk Silas had carved for him. He held it out. "It keeps the bad men away," Leo said, his voice small but certain. It was the most he had ever said to Silas. Silas looked from the boy's earnest face to the carving in his hand. He then reached into his own shirt pocket and pulled out the hawk Leo had given him. He held it up. "This one, too," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He knelt, wincing as the wound in his side protested, until he was eye level with the boy. He didn't smile, not with his mouth, but his eyes were soft, the slate warm to the color of a gentle river. "Thank you, Leo." He stayed there for a long moment, the man, the woman, and the boy, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of a war they had won. The sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling golden light across the land, washing away the shadows. It felt like a benediction. Later, inside the house, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small kitchen, chasing away the last ghosts of the night. Ilara was at the stove, her movements calm and rhythmic. Silas sat at the table, his arm cleaned and bandaged. He was watching her, a quiet intensity in his gaze. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution or mystery. It was a comfortable, shared territory, a home they had built without words. "They won't be back," he stated. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. "I know," she said, not turning from the stove. She slid bacon onto a plate and set it in front of him. Her hand rested on his shoulder for a beat longer than necessary. He did not pull away. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but immense. What now? The ghost had laid his enemies to rest. But where did the man go? You'll stay? Ilara finally asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. She was afraid of the answer. Silas looked down at the plate of food. He looked at the neatly stacked woodpile visible through the window. He heard Leo humming in the other room, a sound of pure, untroubled childhood. He thought of the two wooden hawks, one skilled and one clumsy, resting together in his pocket. He looked up at her, at this woman whose quiet strength mirrored his own, whose courage had given him something to fight for beyond mere survival. For the first time since she had dragged him from the dust, a true smile touched Silas's lips. It was a small, slow thing, like a sunrise after a long night, but it transformed his harsh face, erasing the lines of grief and weariness for a single, brilliant moment. He did not need to speak. The smile was his answer. It was a promise. The storyteller's wind whispered a new legend then, not of the grey ghost of Cinder Creek, but of the quiet man of the western plains. They say he found a home not on a map, but in the steadfast heart of a resilient woman and the trusting eyes of a small boy. They say the land healed, the water ran clean, and the little farm, once a bastion of struggle, became a sanctuary of peace. The ghost had found his place to rest, not in the dust of his past, but in the warm, living soil of his future.